All right, guys. So welcome to the Adam Peeler Fitness Podcast. On this episode, I have the hypertrophy Yoda himself, Dr. Mike Israetel. Mike, how are you doing?
Good. I'm doing really well. Thanks for having me on.
Absolutely. So I guess kind of just want anybody who doesn't know who Dr. Mike is at this point. You probably are a little bit more newer to the fitness scene, but Mike has been putting out a ton of amazing free content for years about bodybuilding, periodization. He has obtained a doctorate in sports science under the tutelage of Dr. Mike Stone, who is one of the most esteemed strength and conditioning specialists who has, correct me if I'm wrong, Dr. Mike, but he was the Olympic training center's best, like one of the head strength and conditioning coaches for years, right?
He was the head sport physiologist at the Olympic Training Center for a while.
Gotcha. Yeah. So, and then he apparently decided to go and teach at East Tennessee State, which is one of the best programs for exercise science in the country. And Dr. Mike learned a lot from him under that. So I guess I wanted to ask Dr. Mike how he came up with the volume landmarks and what I guess inspired that idea, because I found that for myself especially, it's really conceptualized a lot of training and helps people identify certain metrics that really help guide and maximize hypertrophy outcomes.
Yeah, thanks. Actually got the idea for the volume landmarks when I was at East Tennessee State. As a PhD student, we also worked with teams as sport scientists and strength and conditioning coaches. So we would help teams organize their training to some extent. We would help them in the weight room and a bunch of other stuff, help them with their nutrition. And a lot of times in talking to sport coaches, we ended up running into the problem that when we introduced all the benefits of weight training to them, and sometimes they weren't super familiar with them, their first reaction was to say, okay, that all sounds really great. Let's take this weight training and add it on top of our normal sport training. And we think we struggled for a while, and I certainly did, in communicating to sport coaches why a simple addition like that may backfire. And I had trouble putting it into words, and it was going sort of around in circles. And then finally, I sort of coined the term maximum recoverable volume. It's very easy to explain to coaches and say, look, there's a certain amount of training, period, that your athletes can recover from. And any more training than that, because you can't recover from it, you definitely can't adapt to it. And it's just bad. In any case, it's at least not good, and it's probably bad. So when we look at how much training they're doing now, if we want to add training, we have to really be keen on figuring out if that's going to be over their maximum recoverable volume, because if it is, then that addition would really function as a subtraction. It's a really crude analogy would be something like, you want to hang out with some friends. Maybe you have 4 close friends you want to hang out with. And you have a certain amount of attention span and sort of inside jokes with these 4 friends. When the 4 of them are all around, it's the most fun you're ever having, right? If there's 3 of them, oh man, I really wish Frank was here. Frank's the man. But as soon as you go above 5, 6, 7 friends, if you have 10 friends around, you may find that your attention is strained. You're trying to hang out with these multiple sort of semi-groups of friends. You're kind of feeling like you're not in any conversations. The group split up into 2 and there's not one big hangout anymore. Some of the people may not get along. It's kind of over your ability to interact socially. And maybe that's still a good hangout, but actually less people would be an even better hangout. And I know it's tempting to think of like, if someone asked you just straight up at face value, like, how many of your best friends is it cool to hang out with at the same time? I mean, we're all tempted to just say, well, as many as possible, right? Just like in sport training, how much training is good? Well, more training is good. But if your body can't recover from it, or if you can't properly pay attention to all of your friends at the same time, more training and or more friends in the same hangout, analogically, is just no better. And it's probably worse, right? So I came up with this idea of maximum recovered volume is heavily influenced by my discussions with my colleague James Hoffman, who is now my colleague at RP. He's a co-author on pretty much every book I've ever written. Him and I talked about this a lot, and he was also very good at communicating with coaches kind of a real world manner. So we came up with maximum recoverable volume and refined it. Just try to tell coaches, like, look, here's how much your athletes can train. If we just add weight training to it, it's going to make them worse. And they're like, okay, so then what should we do? I said, well, when you're doing your hardest weight training, maybe ease up on sport training a bit. And then they say, but hold on, we need our sport training to be super high level when we're competing. So yeah, so right before you start your competitive phase, you can reduce the weight training and really increase the sport training and get the best of both worlds. That really sunk in with the coaches. It was really easy to communicate. They got a ton out of it. And then we realized that that concept of maximum recoverable volume really does apply to every single kind of training. And that what we've noticed with athletes, powerlifters and bodybuilders and sport athletes, is a lot of folks don't know what their MRV is, and they'll just exceed it on occasion and be baffled as to why they're regressing or not making progress. So that's how we came up with the maximum recoverable volume. That was the first volume landmark. And then later, as we thought about the problems more deeply, we talked to other folks, we started coming up with all the other volume landmarks that just logically sort of emanate from understanding that there are these things called the volume landmarks. So the other volume landmark we figured out was, okay, a certain amount of training volume just doesn't get you any better because it's not enough. So training has to be above your minimum effective volume, MEV, and no higher than your MRV. And then somewhere between those two is a theoretical volume that at any one point would result in maximum adaptations, and that's your MAV, maximum adaptive volume. And then, of course, especially with periodization of sport training, you can't get better at everything all at once. There's the last volume landmark, which is MV, maintenance volume, and that is a very important but often forgotten landmark of how much training do you need to do for something to just keep it from getting any worse. So, for example, if you are somebody who has a really awesome particular type of hit in volleyball, but now you're switching to training other kinds of shots and making them, you don't just completely not train your best ability to put the ball in the court. You may train that, but you train that at maintenance volume, which is a very low amount, just so it doesn't get any worse. So while your other qualities come up, that one is stable, then you flip the script, you start training other qualities while keeping the rest at maintenance volume. Stepwise, you go step, 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 and you get better at everything one step at a time. No steps backwards, only steps forward. Because a lot of times when folks switch their emphasis of sport training onto one thing, they basically forget to put in maintenance volumes of their other qualities. They do get better at the one thing they're training, but worse at all the other things.
Wow, that's an amazing explanation. I have found that for myself too. It's something that you notice as you do get more into the whole training thing, beyond the beginner stage. When you just walk into the gym, you do 3 sets of bicep curls, like, oh my God. But I found that for most people, having that conception really does help them, I guess, understand why their training is going a certain way and why it's not. And I think that I've had experience working with some sport coaches while I was working on my degree in athletic training. And I did bring up sometimes your concepts, and a few of them really, really liked it, and they really ran with it, and they found it to be pretty intuitive and self-explanatory. And I know that for myself. Go ahead.
I said cool.
Oh yeah, sorry. But yeah, so it's kind of cool how it does go, from, it applies to every single area of athletic and, and performance. So I guess you're more or less very well known for the argument of increasing sets across a macrocycle for hypertrophy. I had a question, since my coach, who is actually one of your former students, Jagger Lowe, for powerlifting, he has further extrapolated, I guess, your idea of volume increases from hypertrophy to powerlifting. And I wanted to, I guess, get your rationale behind hypertrophy. Why should we can consider implementing a sort of triple progression where, where you got sets, reps, load to the barbell, or training over the training cycle? And is that a valid strategy for a strength meal cycle, or what would you say about that concept or idea?
Yeah, so the reason you can progress sets in hypertrophy is to meet the volume requirements for what you estimate to be optimal progress. So for example, if you're getting a really good pumps and really good muscle disruption and you're healing just on time for your next session, then you probably are doing a number of sets that is adequate or more than adequate to produce the best hypertrophy levels. However, you may find yourself some number of weeks later doing the same number of sets, and your ability to recover, adapt has increased such that you're not really getting the best pumps anymore. The amount of muscle disruption is unimpressive. And that, let's say you train quads Monday and Thursday, you used to train quads Monday and only by Thursday morning were they healed to go again. But nowadays you train quads Monday and they don't even get sore. And by Tuesday morning, they're not even tired. So if you were to play the counter argument and say, why should I increase my volume? Somebody could say, well, could you do more volume and still recover adequately? And you'd say yes. And then they would ask you, why don't you? You wouldn't have a very good answer, because we know from multiple lines of evidence that doing more volume, if you can recover from it, in most cases produces some more hypertrophy. So, it's almost the easy analogy is, if you're trying to gain weight and struggling to gain weight and you're eating meals and they're not even filling you up and you're pretty ready to eat another meal hours before your next one's planned, but you're complaining that you're not gaining weight as fast as you want. I mean, the easy answer is, why don't you just eat more? And you say, well, no, I don't change the amount of food I eat in a meal, but for once a month. That would be kind of crazy, right? So that's the situation with hypertrophy. With strength, we're looking at something a little bit different, and performance between microcycles needs to be kept very high. In hypertrophy training, you need to hit your performance targets, but you really just need to sort of grind through the reps and sort of just make it happen. With strength training, higher quality sessions are a real big premium. So automatically, you're not going to be pushing as much volume as you can do. So the progression part might not look as aggressive. So there's already an argument there that for strength training, you may not need to progress with volume nearly as much as you would with hypertrophy training. However, with strength training, especially if your mesocycle is a predetermined length. So let's say that you are programmed to do 4 weeks on and 1 week off, or 4 weeks up and 1 week of deload, right? If your training volume in week 2 or 3 is so low that you're barely disrupting at all, it's barely challenging, you know that you could hit more volume and still progress on target for your load increases week to week. In other words, if you play this out and you don't increase volume, you know that if you reach RPE 10 or RPE 9 or whatever in the last week before deloading, and someone asks you, hey, could you hit those numbers again next week or even set mini PRs next week if you didn't deload? If you answer yes, then you didn't do enough volume, because at the end of an accumulation phase for strength training, you should hit your maximum recoverable volume. A lot of times, because the loads increase so much and they're so heavy to begin with, only load increases can get you from MEV to MRV from the beginning to the end of your mesocycle. But sometimes volume additions have to occur. So if the training is profoundly easy and you estimate that, like, look, if I just keep training with 2 or 3 sets per exercise, I'm going to get to my last week, hit my big PRs, but then I'll be able to train another week productively. Well, that's kind of stupid. Then why are you deloading, right? But if you have a pre-programmed deload as part of a macrocycle structure, you know you only have 4 weeks to go, well, in some sense, as hard as you can. And as hard as you can means no harder than you can. So it's definitely don't want to front load the volume like crazy in the first 2 weeks and burn out. But it also means that you probably want a situation in which the week 4 or the last week of your accumulation in a mesocycle, you should finish week 4. And if someone asks you, hey, can you do another productive week and set more PRs? The answer should be like, hell no. There's no way I'm doing that. I'm at the limits of my abilities. Then you know you really pushed your physiology as far as it will go. You got milked all of your gains, and then you have a deload week to recover, revamp, and start again. So it's absolutely fine to progress in volume during strength training, but it has to come from a need, not just like, oh, I'm just going to progress in the following way. If the training is really so understimulative, so non-challenging, and so easy to recover from, that you know you're going to hit all of your load targets and still not run out of juice by the end of week 4 or whatever week you plan to end, then it's probably time to increase volume. You can do this in one of 2 ways. One, you can just start with a higher volume to begin with, and then let the load progressions wear the fatigue down. Or you can start with a lower volume and, as needed, add a set or 2 here and there, especially adding some sets in the last week to really sort of put the exclamation mark on that training cycle and sort of do everything you can.
Gotcha. So more or less with strength, if you were to do any sort of set increases, just because it's more sensitive to fatigue, you would probably want to be more conservative. If you were to do it like maybe in hypertrophy, you would go 4 sets up, for your chest, and maybe strength just 2, and more or less do it more towards the end of the mesocycle instead of the beginning, so you can really gauge whether or not you are recovering on time.
Correct. You really want to step ahead of your recovery. Say, okay, I know I'm recovering for sure. Now I can be a little bit more aggressive potentially. You don't want to front load the stuff. And at the end of the day, what you should have is a plan for loading progression. And yes, some of that should be auto-regulated, but you should have an idea of what kind of loads you'll be adding. So for example, if you're bench pressing, you do 300 pounds for sets of 5 in week 1, you should kind of have an idea. If you have a mesocycle that ends at a certain time, you should have an idea of like when it ends. Hopefully you have 4 weeks of progression. You should have a pretty decent idea of how much weight you're putting on the bar. Not like a shooting pie for the sky goals, like a realistic idea. Say, okay, 300 in week 1, 305 in week 2, 310 in week 3, 315 in week 4, all for sets of 5. And I think that 315 in week 4 for sets of 5 is really going to push me about as far as I can go. And I would consider that a great cycle. So what you do is you do a certain amount of volume in week 1, hit all your 300 for sets of 5s, and then you sort of look back before you start week 2 and think, okay, how impactful was that volume? If you're like, there's basically 3 general answers you could give. First general answer is, dude, that was so easy. I'm for sure going to be able to hit 305 for sets of 5 because my fatigue is super low, but I don't know if I'm stimulating much adaptation. Because remember, strength training isn't just showing off. You have to actually do some work. So you say, okay, I really underdid it. In week 2, I'm going to hit 300 for sets, 305 for sets of 5, no problem. But I'm going to add a few sets so that it's more challenging, right? The other answer you could give is like, man, that was a great amount of volume, a great degree of stimulus. I'm plenty fatigued. I'll still be able to hit 305 for sets of 5 pretty well, but it's going to be a good challenge. And I think I'm really in that sort of middle zone of like really challenged, but still able to do it. And then the last answer is one you don't want, especially in week 1, which is to say you did so much volume that you're like, dude, I don't even know. It's going to be a real struggle for me to hit 305 for sets of 5. And I'm not really so sure I'm going to be able to do it, or I will be able to do it, but there's no way I'm going to be able to do week 3's 310, and definitely no way I'm going to be able to do week 4's 315. So then it's too much volume. At that point, we can get a bit more technical discussion of what to do then, probably take some recovery sessions in the first half of that second week, and then restart from a much lower volume. Because the fatigue is already there, just going down in volume with stimulative training might not be a good idea because the fatigue is already set in place. You might have to have some recovery sessions, which is why you really don't want to overestimate in the first week. Overestimating the first week is much worse than underestimating, because underestimating, you just go up in the second week, no big deal. You got some good training anyway. Overestimating means you have to actively pull back. You know what I mean? It's like, really easy analogy, if you have like red Kool-Aid over a white tablecloth and a cup, under pouring the Kool-Aid means you just pour more Kool-Aid in, no big deal. Over pouring the Kool-Aid means there's red crap everywhere and you have a really nasty cleanup job. Same idea with fatigue. So especially for strength, you want to start on the real low end of set numbers, do that for a week, and then say, okay, maybe it was a little too easy, and then just gingerly bump the set numbers so that every single week meets two criteria. One, the training was challenging, and two, it wasn't so challenging that you can't repeat it again with your planned increase in load again next week. And that checklist, that double checklist, should be checked for every single week, except for the last one. The last one needs only the first checklist. Is the training super stimulative? It doesn't need the second one because you're deloading after that. As a matter of fact, it actively should not have the second checklist of I'm able to go again. If you meet that criteria on your last week before deloading, you're training too easy, and next time you need to train harder.
That makes a lot of sense. So I guess my next follow-up question with that, Mike, would be in terms of the intensity, the relative intensity progression and the intensity progression. If we are talking about load increases, sometimes I've had some training cycles where it's just like, even though I moved heaven and earth and like, I maybe, I could not get better than what I got last mesocycle for sets of 5 on bench press or whatever. In that case, would you say that it would, either would that be an issue of just overloading, like, I guess because Brian Miner will talk about this a lot, about overloading being a range and not a fixed value. Would you say that maybe that might be a sign that I would have too much volume, and then maybe I need to, I guess, how would you differentiate between doing too much volume versus doing too little volume for strength adaptations? Because I know that from reading Scientific Principles of Strength Training, usually MAVs for strength are somewhere between the MEV and MAV for hypertrophy, if I am not mistaken.
Yeah. So like just lower than hypertrophy.
Yeah, just
less
stress. Mm-hmm. Yeah. So I guess how would you differentiate, and how would you I guess if you're to do a block review for an athlete, for a competitive powerlifter, what would you do if they were not able to make seemingly the load progression that they were supposed to? Would you rely more off of their subjective feedback than their objective feedback about, I guess, sort of similarly to, I guess, with your hypertrophy autoregulated increase, using the pump and soreness for hypertrophy, what metrics would you use for strength instead?
So, first of all, two things. One, failure to hit any kind of PR within a mesocycle of normal, healthy training is definitely something that demands our attention, right? Like, it's not like, oh, it's okay, like overloads the spectrum, maybe I'll hit it next time. Like, well, you didn't get any stronger. There's no evidence of you getting stronger. So you can tell yourself all sorts of stuff that may sort of ameliorate your bad feelings about the situation. But the fact of the matter is there is no evidence that you got stronger. So potentially didn't. So it's definitely something you have to think about. First part. Second part, failure to get stronger is an inherently mysterious multifactorial problem, okay? A similar sort of analogy would be, you look at a country that typically grows their economy at, let's say, 5% per year. And then in the next few years, they grew only at 3%. Okay, it's not obvious, even to very well-trained economists studying the issue deeply, what exactly is the problem? Because it could be several things, among other millions of options. Thing one, there could be an obvious clear event, like they had a big ass flood, wiped out their major city, okay? Like, yeah, that will hurt your economy. But it's rarely that simple. Another one is they could just be milking out sort of the S-curve of their current style of economy. And, all economies generally start growing quickly and then slow down until they make a transition to a new technology or level of organization. So maybe it's just that. Maybe 3% is their new normal. Another one is maybe there are like 3 other factors, like, the price for wheat went down, technology imports fell, and weird regulations in another country altogether affected imports and exports and banking. And then all of a sudden, all these 3 or 4 factors, just each one chipped a little bit away at the growth rate, right? So just the same way, so it's a mysterious problem. Just the same way as when we look at strength progress, when you fail to meet strength progress, it's by no means clear to me at face value that volume is the what's wrong, right? As a matter of fact, if you know your MEVs and MRVs well as an athlete, and your training has been between MEV and MRV, that to me says volume is probably not the issue at all. Something else could be the issue. What if it was sleep? What if it's nutrition? What if it was supplementation? What if it was 50 other things? What if the exercise selection was poor? What if you actually had tendonitis in your shoulder and didn't really tell anybody about it, right? So it could be a bunch of stuff. To answer your specific question on training volume, generally speaking, if the athlete perceives, so first of all, they have a historical data on what their MEVs and MRVs are. And strength can be made in any range. Strength gains can be made anywhere between MEV and MRV. It's not specific to just one point between them. So Brian Miner is correct. Overload is absolutely a range. So if you're in that range as an athlete, I'm not thinking volume is a big factor, first of all. Second of all, we can double check that via, as you hinted very intelligently, perceptive measures. So you ask an athlete, like, okay, so your bench press didn't go up during the cycle. Like, right. And now we're assuming we're doing a proper test. They deload and then they see what their bench is doing, right? Because if you don't hit PR within an accumulation phase, maybe it was just masked by high fatigue. Maybe you just had a profoundly effective cycle, which made you both incredibly much stronger and more tired. After the deload, you could be hitting massive PRs, and it's not the mesocycle in which you hit them that did it, it's the one beforehand. You know what I mean? So assuming we're testing after the deload, and let's say you didn't make any gains during that last meso, then we can sort of ask the athlete to rule out the volume stuff or to implicate it potentially. We could say, listen, like, what was your volume perception like over this last meso? And they could say one of several things, basically one of three. One, I felt like I was barely doing any work. Okay. And if they're a good athlete, they're honest athlete, they know how to autoregulate, you don't have to take them at their word, but that's like a pretty serious sign that they may have underdosed the volume and thus failed to make any long-term gains. The other answer could generally be like, it was like a decent amount of volume. I felt challenged, stimulated. It felt like we're putting in high quality work. I felt tired. At the end of the accumulation phase, I was exhausted and I couldn't have done any more. But that's really good. And that probably tells us volume is not the culprit. And then the other thing they could have said is, dude, this mesocycle thrashed me. And it was like crazy amount of volume. I questioned my existence every other day, why I was doing 5 sets of 8 or 8 sets of 5, crazy shit. And then you can think, man, maybe the volume really was overdone, and that was what impeded gains. So the perceptive measures absolutely do come into play, but just big reminder, it's just not clear that volume is the issue at all. There's tons of other factors that could be involved.
Awesome. Yeah, I definitely, I think that you made a really great point about, there's so many indicators, like leading and lagging indicators of fatigue and what could be masking progress, both in with hypertrophy and with strength, just because they usually do take time, and there's a lot of factors that do influence hypertrophy, when muscle, like, when it's preparatory versus actual realized hypertrophy, or with strength, because I've noticed a lot of the times I'm very sensitive to fatigue. I'm very fast twitch muscle fiber dominant. And I remember there was a period of my training, and I'll still have periods where I'm stubborn and I say, I don't need to deload, even though I'm thrashed. And then I get halfway through my next mesocycle cycle, I'm overreached and my joints hurt. And then I deload. And then it's like, oh my God, like I am a God and things are great. And I can have these baller training sessions. And, it's like, I don't feel like, for most people, I think for a lot of times for people like what you said, because strength is so sensitive to fatigue in particular, usually it's probably some sort of fatigue management issue with sleep, nutrition, not properly taking care of fatigue when it's too high, when you've already spent that budget that you had. You basically see your maximum recoverable volume, because something that I know that you say is your maximum recoverable volume will come to you even if you don't come to it.
Sure, just takes a little longer.
Yeah, for sure. Awesome. I did want to ask as well, for people who are, because this is a big issue that I have with my clients and in general in the social media age, in terms of gaining weight and gaining muscle and body dysmorphia, around that process. Because right now I feel like it's been very propagated. I think the big reason why approaches such as main gaining or just eating at maintenance in order, hoping that you're going to get jacked is just going to, all of a sudden you're going to wake up 100, like 200 pounds, lean and jacked.
Mm-hmm.
And I find that a lot of times it comes down to a lot of body dysmorphia. And sometimes people have a really big issue with transitioning from, I guess, diets to maintenance. I've had clients who have really cried or who have insisted on staying in a deficit and trying, and they underreport their step count to me. They're actually, they just increase it because they're scared, even though they are eating more food. I guess my overall question would be, how would you deal with body dysmorphia with athletes who do want to maximize their physique outcomes? Like, this is not just for fun. This is not just for, it's not just, I want to be healthy. It's these people who do actually want to get, that they at least say that they want to get really jacked or really strong. What would you say to them in terms of how do you create that buy-in and understanding of certain trade-offs? Because I think a lot of times people talk a lot about optimization without realizing that there are certain trade-offs to optimizing certain things.
Mm-hmm.
How would you, I guess, go about a situation like that in which you have an athlete who expresses the goals of getting more muscular, having a certain look, and that it's going to take weight gain, some trade-off with fat gain, and maybe being a little bit more uncomfortable right now for that long-term result?
Yeah, I kind of have like a two-prong approach to that. Prong number one is to real talk the fuck out of them. So you just sit them down, or via email or via Zoom call or whatever, or real in person, and you sort of present the situation to them, not confrontationally, but calmly and logically, and say, look, you want X, Y, Z. And they're like, yes, I want to be more muscular. So, okay. Absolutely the most efficient way, possibly the only way in some cases, to achieve that is to eat at a surplus. And, if you don't want to get jacked, you let me know. Most of the most valuable people in society aren't even remotely connected to the enterprise of athletics or being jacked. Bill Gates, Elon Musk, anyone who actually moves the world. I don't know if Elon Musk even lifts weights, or, I don't even know if he walks or has other people walk for him at this point. Who cares, right? Most of the people in your life that you love the most, your mom, your grandma, these beautiful souls, they don't lift weights either. So we don't have to do sports. Athletes are usually pieces of shit. So you can tell them, look, you can get out anytime you want. But if you're in, I'm here to provide you with the best results. Do you want the best results? And they go, yes. And they go, do you want to do what it takes to get the best results? And they go, yes. And they're like, do you realize that some of these things may be uncomfortable precisely in the ways that you hate the most? And they go, yeah, I'm hardcore. Let's do it. And I'm like, great, we're going to start gaining weight. And then prong number two, and you can sort of do a redux of this talk every time they need it. Prong number two is whatever approach you wanted to take, because they're sensitive, you want to take a moderated version of that approach. Ease them in. So for example, if you think that an athlete should gain 10 pounds of total tissue over the next whatever number of weeks, but you realize over the course of conversing with them that they are pretty body dysmorphic and really are averse to fat gain, once you real talk them for the buy-in, you say, okay, we're just going to go for 5 pounds over the next 15 weeks. And then as they do that, they're going to be scared, right? Because they think they're going to get fat. As they do that, first of all, the real talk comes in whenever they falter. And then second of all, as they do it, they're going to be like, well, I'm actually, man, I'm not stuffing myself really to gain 5 pounds. It's not that much. And so I'm not bloated, I'm not uncomfortable. And then they realize yeah, they're abs aren't as crisp, but they're really in pretty good shape still. And at the end of the process, they're like, wow, I fucking did it. I gained 5 pounds. Like, dude, high five, you did it. And they're like, man, that wasn't that bad. I'm like, see, it's not that bad. And now we diet for 2 or 3 weeks, mini cut, and you get rid of all the fat anyway. And then we can restart again. And they're like, man, what the hell was I even scared of, right? Because if you tried the other way, if you really real talk the shit out of them and you did a super dirty mega bulk, what is that called? Dreamer bulk. You slap 20 pounds on them and they get super fat. they're going to get super discouraged and they're going to quit or they're going to cry, some combination of the two. You don't want that. So when you know an individual is sensitive, you got to jar them out of that sensitivity by real talking the shit out of them, asking them why the hell they're in sport to begin with. And then once they give you the sort of affirmation, yeah, okay, like let's do it, you do a moderated version. And then look, if they do really well with that, you can keep doing moderated versions, or you can ask them to say, hey, you want to push it a little harder this time? And because they have a great mass phase under their belt where they didn't get like Jabba the Hutt fat like they thought they were gonna, they might be like, you know what? Yeah, fuck it, let's do it. Let's gain 7 this time. You gain 7, they're like, man, that was fucking no problem. I didn't even get that fat. And all of a sudden, you're gaining 10 like you were supposed to a couple of years down the line. Now they're like embarrassed / it's funny that they ever even feared the stuff. You know what I mean?
Mm.
So I think that two-pronged approach probably has some merit.
Yeah, I found that for myself, because I had a background of, I was actually anorexic for 5 years, and I remember gaining weight was like one of the scariest things I ever had to do. But really just trusting that the process and really understanding, like, I want to, not only have a better quality of life, but I also just want to like look more jacked, more muscular, and get strong. And
Sure.
It's something that I know I admittedly still do struggle with, every now and then, because it's cool being lean. Like, it's really cool, like,
Mm-hmm.
looking in the mirror, like, holy crap, like I look like this. But I
Yeah.
think that one of your quotes in one of your videos is, there's only so much jacked 160 pounds, not 60 pounds.
Yeah.
And that's what I've been kind of saying a lot to my clients. I've gained 7 pounds in the past 4 months, and like,
Mm-hmm.
like I'm not as crisp as I once was, but like, who cares? Like, I'm more jacked, and it's
And you can get crisp anytime you want.
exactly. So sometimes just having somebody that you trust as a coach, and somebody who has your best interest at heart is I guess really important. I guess having somebody who's been there and who can guide you along and say, hey, look, this is what to expect, and I'm here to keep you on the path that you tell me that you want to be on. This is what it takes, and it might be a little bit scary right now, but trust me, and we'll go through the process. And hey, if you don't like it, you don't have to do it again, but at least
Yeah.
you tried it. I guess
Totally.
go ahead.
Sorry, go ahead.
I guess just not having that all or nothing approach of like, oh, I'm in this for life, like, because guess what, like, some people, like, they'll try it, they'll hire you as a coach, and they'll give their best shot, and they'll be like, you know what, I actually just really want to just lift weights like 2 days per week, and then like just have fun with my girlfriend and
Sure.
play World of Warcraft. Like, that's fine.
Yeah. Yeah. 100%. It's all about just setting these little short-term goals and seeing if you can achieve them, and also seeing if you like to achieve them. And then if you really like it, you just keep going. And then all of a sudden, you may find yourself to be a championship athlete, or you may find at any one point in the journey, you've cut yourself off to just being a regular person, which is totally cool too.
Yeah, I think that's just so important to just iterate to people, because you don't have to train like a bodybuilder or a powerlifter if you want to look like have a good level of health and whatnot.
For
But
sure.
I guess so, Mike, we're coming up on the hour, but I wanted to, I guess the last question would be, you just competed in a show, and I know that this has kind of been a big culmination. You won the overall, if I'm not mistaken, correct, Masters.
Yep.
Yeah. So how big are you? You're 235 right now, and 5'6".
Correct. Yeah.
So that's kind of insane. Congratulations on that. Anybody who's been doing this
Thank you.
for a long time knows how difficult it is to build muscle. So Dr. Mike's doing an excellent job of showing us how to, ascend into the Thanos levels of jacked. But I guess I wanted to ask you, what was the biggest things that you've learned from this prep? And I know that one thing that you really struggle with is water retention. And I'm sure that this has other biochemical reasons behind it, of exogenous supplementation. But what were some things that you've learned throughout the process of dieting, and how to manage, I guess, water retention specifically? Because I hold a ton of water when I diet, and it can
Yeah.
be really, really debilitating at times. Looking in the mirror some days, you're like, what the heck is happening? Like I know
Right.
I know I'm in a deficit. I do not dream of sugary foods, and I'm not in a deficit.
Yeah, for sure. So two really easy things. One, standardize your water intake. So just have about the same amount of water each day. And if you have more physical activity, you can have some more. Less, you can have some less. But basically, like sort of find out how much water you drink normally, and then just standardize that, and just sort of that's mystery solved as to why bro bodybuilders walk around with a gallon jug of water, because they have to standardize their water intake because their coaches already knew how that works. So, I like during this prep at an average daily water intake of 6 liters, and just had 6 liters every day. And if I wanted more water, I usually just didn't have any more. Like, unless I was really thirsty or something, and then I did, but that was very rare. And if I didn't feel like drinking the 6 liters, I did anyway, because that basically kept my water the same. And then it wouldn't allow water fluctuations to be very great. And then secondly, I standardized my salt intake. I measured out how much seasoning I was putting on all my foods. I ate the same foods pretty much every day. And then I knew my salt was stable. And all of a sudden, whatever water amount I was holding was pretty constant, right? It just didn't change much. So even though I still held water during the whole prep, it was about the same amount of water all the time. And then as I got leaner and leaner and leaner, I would see more and more details and be like, wow, this is amazing. And my body weight cooperated and all that other stuff. So standardizing water and salt intake was one of those really interesting examples of how advice from prep bodybuilders is so much different and wildly inapplicable, and a matter of fact, really stupid for people who just want to lose weight, people, or just get in shape and get leaner. People oftentimes say, to get what the best are doing, you have to copy the best. Okay, but there's elements of what the best are doing that are just very specific, exotic things. Like, for example, if you're trying to learn how to drive a race car, maybe looking at what, a professional driver does in some capacity is really good. Like where they put their eyes on the road, they put it, ahead of the curve, not behind the curve, so on and so forth. That can transfer to just driving your own car faster. But like about the kind of helmet they buy, well, you're in a fucking regular car. You don't need a fucking helmet. What the hell is wrong with you? So if you go out and you buy a helmet for just trying to get faster in your own car, you're an idiot because you applied the absolutely wrongest part of the process to yourself, and it's just no transfer unless you are driving basically a professional race car. So in much the same way, people back in the day, and actually still, when they start diets, they're like, all right, so I got to eat the same foods all the time. I got to drink the same amount of water, and I got to eat the same amount of salt. You're like, oh, what the hell would you do that for? Just do it if it fits your macros, eat great healthy foods, create a calorie deficit, and you're going to be just fine. 3 months later, you're going to lose a ton of fat, keep all your muscle. It's going to be amazing and super highly non-inconvenient. But if you want to take a shot at competitive bodybuilding, especially if you're using exogenous supplements that can play real crazy tricks with water balance, then standardizing water intake and salt intake, which does make it pretty inconvenient, is a really, really good thing that works wonders. So those are the two big lessons, I think, from I mean, I had already learned them in the last diet I did, but the last diet I did ended in COVID-19 instead of in a prep. So I didn't have a chance to put myself on a bodybuilding stage.
Makes sense. I found that helps me and a lot of my clients too who are realizing that too, as well as just normalizing their sleep, because sleep is just so big with I guess the cortisol, like really everything, but like especially like the Brennan and the angiotensin and all that stuff. I did want to ask. I noticed that in when dieting down, people usually have an approach of either insisting, let's train heavy, like 5 to 10 rep range all the time. Um, and myself personally, I gravitate more towards since volume we know is the primary driver of hypertrophy, and because of some biochemical changes that happen within the muscle itself and ways that your body can express force in an energy deprived state, especially for severe energy restriction and low energy availabilities, I gravitate more towards a higher volume per set. But I wanted to ask you, when dieting down, what approach did you take this time for your training, and why? Like how did you manage that with the fatigue, the lower energy, the lethargy and just fatigue management overall, and still being able to provide a stimulus to the muscle to stay around.
Yeah. I train normally almost the entire time until the last few weeks when water fluctuations and the drying out process kind of begin. And then you have to train at slightly higher repetitions, slightly lower volumes because you want to manage fatigue and keep it low. You've already sort of kept all your muscle on and it's not going anywhere. And also you want to really minimize injury risk. So I basically trained fundamentally quite normally the entire time until the very end.
Gotcha. Okay, and then I did have one, I guess, last question would be, what was the role of using the food palatability reward hypothesis with your diet? Because I know that sometimes that's something that a lot of people, I guess, they don't really understand. I guess what were your food choices like, and how did they change throughout the prep based off of how hungry you were and
Yeah.
experience?
Yeah, good question. So like at the beginning of the prep, I'm not very hungry and I get sort of plenty of food to eat. Would eat a more varied amount of foods and occasionally go out to restaurants with my friends and my family, have like sushi and have like teriyaki noodles and stuff like that. And then towards the middle of the diet, started to notice that going to sushi was more of a suffering than benefit because what I wanted to do was eat a whole restaurant, but what I was allotted was a certain number of rolls, which was dwindling in number. So it was more like torture,
Yeah.
right? It's kind of the most crude analogy. If you're abstaining from sex for whatever reason, you don't like do a hardcore makeout session with your wife and girlfriend and then be like, all right, we're done. You probably just don't do any of that.
Yeah.
It is probably best. Doesn't start you down that path. So my foods became progressively blander and more high volume as progression occurred. More fruits, more brown rice, more whole grains, but less seasoning and no restaurant stuff. So I didn't really go to any restaurants in the last few months. And it helps a lot because that way, you still get all of your nutrition in, but then you're not crazy looking forward to meals all the time because they're just not that good. And the meals are still good because you're so hungry, you'll eat anything. So you still get a lot of pleasure out of food. But once you're done eating, you're like, okay, that was pretty sweet. And I could go a few hours without eating because, it was just chicken and broccoli and brown rice. Nobody gets too excited over that. So, and now that when the show ended for the first, or after the show for the first 5 or 6 days, I only had a lot of clean food. I didn't have any cheat foods. And then I had a first cheat meal a couple days ago. And I've had like one cheat meal a day ever since then. And I'm all bloated as hell. But most of my food throughout the day anyway is relatively low palatability. And so I can eat a lot of it and feel really full. And then I have a little bit of cheat meal at the end. And then it's all good and well. So it's, the alternative would be twofold, is to try to diet down all the way on very tasty foods, which is basically just torture, and does raise your stress levels, by the way, which is bad for physiological muscle retention abilities and fat loss. And then also people will do the thing where instead of having a couple of days or even longer of sort of just clean eating right after a show, as soon as the show ends, what they'll do is they'll just go straight to junk, which tastes amazing, but it bloats them like crazy. It makes them real upset at what they look like. And also it, after that, they sort of have to seek the next and the next and the next most tasty thing. Instead, if you eat lower palatability foods for a while, even the moderate palatability foods are so amazing compared to what you eat on prep. You sort of incrementally expose yourself to them, and it's pleasurable all around, and you never feel overwhelmed, and you never eat such a high amount of calories for several days on end that you gain an excessive amount of body fat. And the thing is, right after a show, gaining excessive body fat is actually probably a decent idea because you want to raise your body fat levels back into productive anabolic levels and get all your hormones right. But you don't want to do it in such a way that causes crazy bloating and terrible feelings. It's probably good to ease in.
Yeah, I I can definitely attest to that with with myself, just having an appropriate dietary periodization. I guess it's kind of funny. We like to periodize lots of things in this sport, but having a dietary periodization that's appropriate for your goals to help you achieve your outcomes is really important. And with incorporating more rigidity and blander foods during a diet, anybody who's been dieting down, who's been very, very, very lean, knows that any food is like, oh my gosh, this is incredible.
Yeah.
I always laugh at your comments section about your food choices, because these people clearly don't FPRH. But anyways,
For sure. They're like, wouldn't that be tastier if you ate it this other way? I'm like, yes, it would. And they're like, why don't you
why aren't you putting
that?
a gallon of stevia on in your protein, like in your protein pudding? What is your protein pudding? You're eating
Right.
protein pudding. It's like, yes. It's like, that tastes good. It's like anything tastes good. They're like, what?
Yeah, and I don't want it to taste that good.
Yeah. Oh man, casein pudding is that's something that I can only eat dieting, and besides that, I'm like, I want to throw up. Anyway.
Dude, I have this exact same experience, because I remember like I had a really great success eating casein pudding during a diet, and then when I transitioned to massing, like I was traveling a little bit right after the diet, and I didn't have a chance to sit down and eat the pudding. And then when I sort of locked into a really good off-season diet, I programmed casein pudding in there. I had to eat it the first day, and I was like, what the hell? It like slid down my throat. It took like 30 seconds. I was like, nope,
Yeah.
can't do that. So I just had to drink casein shakes. I just had to get it down somehow.
Yeah, it's insane how your body just changes its response to food. So yeah, I think I almost threw up once when I was having it in mass days, and I swore off that
That's a
forever.
good way to throw up.
And that's definitely diet food. Well, anyways, Dr. Mike, thank you so much for your time today. I really, really appreciate it. I guess now time for any of your plugs, anything that you have coming out soon, where the people can find you and whatnot.
Yeah, my only plug is check out the Renaissance Periodization YouTube. We have a channel. It's growing all the time. Every week we post 5 content videos, and it's all about learning. We're not an entertainment channel, even though I put my little bullshit humor into a lot of stuff. I don't think anyone actually thinks it's funny. It's, if you want to learn about hypertrophy, strength, health, fat loss, Dr. Spencer Nadolsky's there every week doing something about health. He's currently going through the actual health repercussions of obesity. Because a lot of people say, well, being obese is bad for health. And then people push back and say, okay, exactly how? They're like, well, like body fat's bad, being overweight's bad. And like, okay, but what actually happens? He's doing like a multi-part video, and he's on part number 5, I think now, of really what the problems are with obesity. So check that out. I think your audience would really enjoy it.
All right. And then follow Mike on Instagram too, for sure. Just RP Dr. Mike, correct?
Yeah, sure. Yeah, if you want like more BS and less learning.
Yeah. He posts some good stuff. But anyways, guys, thank you so much for watching. For listening to the podcast. And I'll talk to you guys in the next one.